Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I particularly want to thank Congressman Gohmert for organizing this discussion on federal lands policy and his highlighting of the federal footprint map. You can find that at naturalresources.house.gov/federal footprint, or just Google federal footprint. And when you do, you'll have a complete picture of how much land the federal government owns and how much of your state and your community is affected. And it may surprise you. For example, the federal government owns just 0.7% of the entire state of New York. It owns just 1.1% of the state of Illinois. It owns just 1.8% of the state of Texas. But then go further west, and you'll see the reason for the Western Revolt. The federal government owns and controls 62% of the state of Alaska. It owns and controls 2/3 of the state of Utah, 81% of the state of Nevada. In my home state of California, the federal government owns nearly half, 48% is federal land. In one county in my district, Alpine County, the federal government owns 93% of the land. Now, if you're not from one of the western states, you need to understand what that means. That's all land that's completely off the local tax rolls. That's land that carries increasingly severe restrictions on public use and access, which means it's generating very little economic activity in these regions. And often, federal ownership means that federal land use policies are in direct contravention to the wishes of the local communities that are entangled with it. Now, recently, the Natural Resources Committee held a field hearing in North Las Vegas at the request of Congressman Crescent Hardy. Now, if you've ever flown into Las Vegas, you know how vast are the empty and unutilized lands of Nevada, stretching as far as the horizon. Yet the local leaders there all complained of how the region's economy suffers from a great shortage of land for homes and shops, businesses and infrastructure. What an irony, and what a commentary about the harm that's being done by the decisions of our federal land managers. You know, more than a century ago, we began setting aside the most beautiful lands in the nation for the use, resort, and recreation of the American people. That was the wording of the original Yosemite land grant signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1864. But somewhere along the way, public use, resort, and recreation became look but don't touch. And the federal government became indiscriminate and voracious in the amount of land under its direct control. As I said, my congressional district's in the heart of the Sierra Nevada. Common complaints from my constituents and from local government officials range from abusive federal regulatory enforcement, inflated fees that have forced families to abandon cabins they've held for generations, exorbitant new fees that are closing down long-established community events, road closures, and arbitrary denial of grazing permits for family ranchers who go back generations on that land. A small town in my district that's trying to install a $2 million spillway gate for their reservoir was just given a $6 million estimate from the Forest Service just to relocate a hiking trail and a handful of campsites. And let me give you one quick story of what it means to be entangled in this federal morass. It came to me from the sheriff of Plumas County, that's just outside of my district. An elderly couple go horseback riding near their home. They come across an old horseshoe. The wife picks it up, and an ambitious young Forest Service official saw her pick it up. Well, the next thing they knew, 6 armed federal law enforcement officers descended upon their home. They tore it apart and ultimately prosecuted this elderly couple for removing the horseshoe, charging them criminally with stealing from the federal government. Now, ultimately, the federal judge dismissed the charges and chastised the officials responsible for this travesty, but only after this couple had gone through hell. Now, ask yourself how your local economy would fare if the federal government owned 93% of the land in your county, forbade or greatly restricted any economic activity on it, and ignored the pleas of your local city council or county board. In my district, the federal government's consigned our forests to a policy of benign neglect. We now have roughly 4 times more trees per acre than the land can support. In this overcrowded and stressed condition, the trees can no longer resist drought and beetle infestation, and today an estimated 85% of the pine trees in the Sierra National Forest, that's just adjacent to Yosemite National Park, are dead. And I'm talking Christmas tree in July dead, just waiting to be consumed by catastrophic fire. The National Park Service estimates it's facing more than $12 billion of maintenance backlog, yet we keep adding to the federal holdings that we can't take care of now. That's why the federal footprint map's so important to understand, and why fundamental reform of our land use policy is of paramount importance. Now, the Federal Land Subcommittee has 3 principal goals: to restore public access to the public lands, to restore sound management to the public lands, and to restore the federal government as a good neighbor to those communities most impacted by the federal lands. But overarching all of these imperatives is the simple fact that excessive federal land ownership in the West has become a stultifying drag on our economies and a direct impediment to our ability to take good care of our public lands. I thought Congressman Gohmert put it best in a subcommittee hearing we held almost 2 years ago now, when he compared the federal government's land use policies to the old miser whose great mansion has become the town eyesore, overgrown with weeds, paint peeling, roof dilapidated, broken windows, while the old miser spends all of his time and money plotting how he can buy his neighbor's land. There needs to be a proper balance between federal ownership, state and local stewardship, and the productive private ownership of the lands. One look at the federal footprint map should warn even the most casual observers that we have lost that balance and that we need to restore it. I again thank the gentleman for organizing this time today and for yielding his time to me, and I now yield it back.
Thank Mr.